For the past 30 years, governments around the world have tried to build their own Silicon Valley. In the 1990s, Malaysia launched the Multimedia Super Corridor and built Cyberjaya, a planned intelligent city designed to attract global tech firms with tax incentives and modern infrastructure. In France, policymakers supported large-scale startup initiatives, culminating in projects like Station F, now one of the world's largest startup campuses. These projects involved serious planning and long-term ambition. Many other governments pursued similar technology hubs with equal intensity. And yet, none have produced another Apple, Google, or NVIDIA, or a cluster capable of dominating the global technology economy. More importantly, none have become a sustained magnet for global talent, a place where engineers, investors, and entrepreneurs from around the world converge almost instinctively. So why is there still only one Silicon Valley, concentrated in a narrow stretch of Northern California in the United States? The popular explanation is culture, that Americans are simply more innovative, more risk-taking, more entrepreneurial. There's truth in that. But culture doesn't explain how one stretch of farmland became the most powerful technology ecosystem in modern history. Silicon Valley emerged from a chain reaction of geopolitical shocks, institutional decisions, government funding, and a handful of consequential gambles. To understand how, we have to go back to a time when it didn't exist at all. In the 1940s, the region south of San Francisco that we now call Silicon Valley was known for something very different. It was agricultural land. Apricot orchards, plum trees, and cherry farms stretching for miles. So many fruit trees, in fact, that locals referred to it as the Valley of Heart's Delight. If you had visited then and predicted that this region would one day shape the global technology economy, the idea would have seemed improbable, which is precisely why what followed deserves closer examination. It did not begin with entrepreneurs or venture capital. It began with geopolitics. After World War II ended in 1945, a new strategic anxiety settled over the United States. The Cold War intensified competition with the Soviet Union, and nuclear weapons reshaped military doctrine. Technological superiority became a national priority. Radar systems, missile guidance, and advanced electronics were no longer academic pursuits. They were matters of national security. In response, the U.S. government significantly expanded funding for scientific research. By the early 1950s, federal research spending had crossed $1 billion annually, an extraordinary commitment for that period. Much of that funding flowed not to private corporations, but to universities. One of the institutions best positioned to absorb it was Stanford University. At the center of its engineering school was Frederick Terman, a professor who believed the university could play a more active role in shaping industry. Rather than allowing talented graduates to leave California after completing their studies, Terman encouraged them to establish companies nearby. His aim was not simply academic excellence, but the creation of a local technological base connected to the university itself, effectively turning Stanford into an engine of innovation. One early example, even before the Cold War funding surge, was Hewlett Packard. In 1939, two Stanford graduates, Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard, founded their company in a small garage in Palo Alto, a garage later recognized as the symbolic birthplace of Silicon Valley. Terman had encouraged them to pursue the venture rather than seek stable corporate jobs elsewhere. Stanford owned large tracts of undeveloped land near its campus. Instead of selling it for housing or commercial real estate, it chose to lease that land to technology firms. This decision led to the creation of the Stanford Industrial Park. What followed was structural. Startups were no longer scattered across cities. They were adjacent to laboratories. A professor could develop an idea and, within minutes, discuss its commercial application with a nearby firm. Engineers moved between academia and industry without leaving the neighborhood. An ecosystem began to take shape, and ecosystems compound. In 1956, William Shockley, one of the inventors of the transistor and a Nobel Prize winner, returned to the region and founded Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory in nearby Mountain View. His goal was ambitious: build the next generation of silicon-based electronics. Shockley was brilliant. He was also notoriously difficult to work with. Within a year, 8 of his top young engineers grew frustrated with his management and left the company. In many regions, that might have been the end of the story. Instead, something very different happened. Those 8 engineers, later known as the Traitorous 8, secured funding from an East Coast investor and founded Fairchild Semiconductor in 1957. Fairchild did not just succeed. It became a launchpad. Over the next decade, dozens of engineers left Fairchild to start their own firms. Intel was one of them, a company that would later pioneer the microprocessor and power the personal computing revolution. Many others followed, shaping what would become the modern semiconductor industry. This pattern, talent leaving, forming new firms, and then spawning more firms, became known as the Fairchild Diaspora. Conflict did not end innovation. It multiplied it. And that multiplication happened because capital was available, proximity was dense, and experimentation was tolerated. What might have remained a single laboratory in another region became, in Northern California, the seed of an entire industry. Then, in October 1957, something happened that fundamentally altered the American mindset. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. It was a small metal sphere, barely the size of a beach ball. But when it began orbiting Earth and broadcasting its steady radio signal, the implications were enormous. If the Soviets could place a satellite into orbit, they could potentially deliver nuclear warheads across continents. For the first time, Americans felt technologically vulnerable. Newspapers described it as a national humiliation. Politicians spoke of a missile gap. Schools began revising science curricula almost overnight. Sputnik was not just a scientific milestone. It was a geopolitical shock. In response, the United States moved quickly. In 1958, it created the Advanced Research Projects Agency, later known as DARPA. Its mandate was clear: ensure the United States would never again be surprised technologically. DARPA was given unusual freedom. It could fund high-risk, long-horizon research without the bureaucratic constraints typical of government agencies. And once again, Stanford was among the institutions best positioned to absorb that funding, particularly in emerging fields like computing and networked systems. What followed was not a single breakthrough, but a sustained wave of investment into foundational technologies. In 1969, one of the first ARPANET nodes was established at the Stanford Research Institute, directly linking the region to the origins of what would become the modern Internet. Many of these breakthroughs depended on silicon, a common element found in sand, but uniquely suited for controlling electrical currents when purified and engineered at microscopic scales. By the late 1960s, companies in the region had become leaders in manufacturing silicon-based transistors and chips. The nickname Silicon Valley began circulating in the early 1970s, reflecting the region's growing dominance in this critical material. What had begun as defense-driven research was steadily becoming an industrial base. Over the following decades, federal defense funding expanded dramatically, and this changed the risk equation completely. If a prototype failed, the broader research funding did not immediately disappear. Scientists could experiment freely, take big risks, try crazy ideas. At the same time, a new financial architecture was taking shape. Venture capital firms such as Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia Capital began channeling private capital into high-risk startups, amplifying the cycle of experimentation. Public research reduced early-stage risk. Private venture capital scaled successful bets. Together, they elevated the funding ecosystem to a new level. Then came the people, not just American engineers, the world's engineers. In 1965, the United States reformed its immigration laws, removing nationality-based quotas and prioritizing skilled migration. Over the following decades, engineers, scientists, and programmers from across the world entered the American technology sector. Many gravitated toward Northern California. This mattered. By the 1990s and 2000s, a significant share of startups in the region had at least one immigrant founder. Consider the trajectory of Elon Musk. Born in South Africa, educated in North America, and drawn to Silicon Valley during the Internet boom. Like many others, he arrived not because the region was geographically convenient, but because the infrastructure, capital, engineering depth, and risk tolerance was already concentrated there. But talent alone does not explain scale. The final ingredient was incentives. Employees weren't just earning salaries, they were acquiring equity. If a company succeeded, even early engineers could benefit directly through stock options. This alignment between effort and ownership changed behavior. Risk became rational. The pattern repeated across generations. In 2004, a college networking site built in a Harvard dorm room quickly relocated to Palo Alto. That company would become Facebook. The move wasn't symbolic, it was practical. The capital, the engineers, and the advisors were already concentrated there. A year later, 3 former PayPal employees launched a simple video sharing platform in San Mateo. Within 18 months, YouTube was acquired by Google for $1.65 billion in stock. The same pattern had played out decades earlier with semiconductor firms, and later with companies like Apple and Google. Different industries, different founders, the same institutional environment. This is the part many governments misunderstand. They attempt to replicate the visible elements, technology parks, tax incentives, startup branding, while overlooking the institutional depth beneath them. You can construct office buildings quickly. You cannot construct institutional trust, capital culture, university integration, and immigration pipelines on command. Silicon Valley was not built in a single moment. In 1951, Stanford structured proximity between academia and industry. In the late 1950s and 1960s, defense funding expanded advanced research. In 1965, immigration policy widened the talent base. And in the 1970s, Venture capital firms such as Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia Capital institutionalized high-risk startup financing, allowing successful ideas to scale rapidly. Each layer reinforced the others. So yes, American culture played a role. Ambition and entrepreneurship were present. But those traits existed long before Silicon Valley became what it is today. What changed was the surrounding architecture, the system, and systems compound. Ecosystems of that depth are not copied. They are accumulated. That is why so many countries continue trying to build the next Silicon Valley, and why, decades later, there is still only one. If you enjoy examining the institutional forces that quietly shape nations and economies, subscribe to Whispering Peepaw. We don't chase headlines. We examine the systems behind them. I'll see you in the next one.